I, your abhorrent host, welcome you again to the House of Tears, and I extend to you a different tale than those prior. It is simple, clear-cut, and you've likely already heard of it, the Camp Greenwood Massacre. If you have not, be forewarned and forearmed. When evil is afoot, the only result is a truly bloody one. We must begin with our doomed souls. They are mere children, but capable and culpable nonetheless. We start with an Adam, a young boy who had only recently discovered that the wonders of a girl's fancy outweighed his worries about cooties. Becky, as you'll find, was a naive and well-meaning girl, with her head so full of clouds that I'm surprised she didn't simply float away. There was another boy that was more obsessed with physical feats and competition with other boys than he was blessed with any sensibility. Chad. Is it not usually a Chad? Regardless, Deborah and Elizabeth are best defined by their inherent lack of anything beyond each other. The girls spoke always in turn, wore their matching necklaces like medals of honor, and staunchly ignored the fact that they were entirely incapable of any identity outside of one another. Frank is our last. He was a quiet young man without a voice whenever he stepped among stronger voices, and he was always around stronger voices. Our story technically begins several years before the Camp Greenwood Massacre. Many things as tragic as this do. You'll find things rarely start or end exactly when the clock starts. This is one such thing. At the time, these children were housed in 2 neighboring cabins at the very same camp where the killings would happen. Adam was still very convinced of girls' contagion. Chad was spending his summer egging Adam into arm wrestling, pillow fights, races, and breath-holding competitions. Frank would have rather stayed home entirely, as ostracized as he was in Boys' Cabin 6. Meanwhile, in Girls' Cabin 6, Becky told stories about romance and fantasy while braiding Deborah and Elizabeth's hair in turn as they exchanged frustrated glances at their oblivious third wheel. But this is where our incident occurs. The counselors of Cabin 6 were a sweet young man named Greg and a quiet girl named Helen. In between Becky's daydreams, she lamented how lonely their counselors looked and expressed a childishly sweet dream about Helen and Greg falling in love over this summer. This was enough to pique Deborah and Elizabeth's attention. After all, would it not be exciting to be a key part of another's love story? So, they encouraged Becky's fantasy, and sweet, naive Becky ran with it, plotting Helen and Greg's beautiful confession and fantastic love. Her fantasy became a fixation, and her fixation led her to enlist Frank, and Frank to mention it at the demands of Chad and Adam, who in turn thought it would be funny to ruin the girls' plans. While Deborah and Elizabeth convinced Helen that they desperately needed help in the boat shack, Frank did the same for Greg. While Becky decorated it with hand-picked flowers and woven paper garlands, Chad and Adam set up in the bushes with firecrackers. When Greg and Helen met, it all went swimmingly. The teens were certainly flustered and embarrassed by children setting them up, but knew love as a wonderful drug. The sound of popping firecrackers only set up further blinders. Helen screamed, and Greg promised to check out the noise. Chad and Adam had already scampered away, but left behind still-lit matches and another firecracker's fuse burning. These firecrackers, may I note, as it is certainly important, had been set only a short distance away from the boathouse's fuel stores. It is a tragic coincidence, then, that a canister had been pierced by a stray arrow from the archery range earlier that day, or that just as Greg stomped out the lit matches, the firecracker ignited the fuel. Greg was so badly burned that his corpse was identified by dental records. Helen, meanwhile, was recovered from the wreckage of the boathouse and taken by helicopter to a local hospital where she would spend the next year in a medically induced coma, and a few more recovering her ability to move. Her face and her voice would never be recovered. So you might imagine Helen's resentment and rage. A boy she might have loved, dead, any beauty or ability to speak up, destroyed. Worse, no one would ever be held responsible. The poor management of the camp was swept away by a change in leadership, and children couldn't have known any better. After all, if anything, wouldn't Greg and Helen be responsible for the tragedy, since, after all, they were responsible for the supervision and care of the children? That is what the lawyers argued at the very least. Now I must confess that Helen never truly intended on Massacre. She intended nothing more than the destruction of Camp Greenwood, and her own death in the same place that held her happiest and saddest memory, the boathouse. She was meticulous in setting up the cabins, the wreck house, the administrative building, and the boathouse to blow with a simple combination: lighter fluid, gasoline, and fireworks. Except the start of camp had been moved on this particular summer, and a bus of children arrived with only 2 adults and a handful of bright-eyed teens and children. Perhaps she would have reconsidered and postponed her plans, but then she heard a chittering laugh. Becky's laugh never did change. The pity is that had those children been only a year older, they would no longer have been young enough to be campers. Perhaps then the story would be different. As it was, the sound of Becky's laugh, Adam and Chad's noisy wrestling as they tumbled off the bus, the entwined arms of Deborah and Elizabeth, and Frank's trailing presence must have sealed their fate. Helen waited. She waited until every child was asleep in their beds, the teens quietly gossiping in the counselor's cabin, and the adults were just a bit too tipsy from the late-night beers to celebrate managing 30 campers and 10 rowdy teen counselors. The first explosions were at Cabin 6. Then the wreck house, Cabins 3 and 7, the administrative building, more cabins, and as planned, the boathouse last. This time Helen would not be recovered, and only a few teens and children from the last cabins to be lit managed to escape immediate death. Even fewer survived their injuries. The same injustice that Helen wore, the very one that cornered her within her own mind, was now inflicted 30-fold on others. And what justice is there in that? There is no moral, no sense to the Camp Greenwood massacre. Just human recklessness becoming misery, and there's no way for sense to be made of such suffering. This is only yet another cog in the cycle of misery. Is that not why it is here, among the many tales held in the House of Tears? You will return again, as you must. There are more stories for you to bear witness to. They demand your attention, the feeling in your soul. This is your command. Return again to my House of Tears.